The courtroom was packed, as it often was on Tuesday mornings. People shuffled in with tired eyes, some holding coffee cups, others clutching folders or crumpled citations. The air smelled faintly of old wood, floor polish, and the nervous sweat that always seemed to hang around places where decisions were made that could change someone's day or life in just a few minutes. At the back of the room, near the heavy wooden doors, a teenager stood quietly. She wore faded jeans, scuffed sneakers, and a gray hoodie pulled low over her forehead. Her hands were tucked into her pockets, shoulders slightly hunched like she was trying to disappear into the wall. Most people didn't even notice her. If they did, they probably assumed she was there to support a friend or wait for a parent. No one expected her to be the next person called to the bench, but then the clerk read out a case number and her name. She stepped forward without hesitation. Her walk was calm, steady. No drama, no sighs, no eye-rolling like some of the others who'd been called that morning. She stopped just before the railing, stood straight and looked up at the judge. He barely glanced at her. Case 4827, he said, flipping a page in his docket. Failure to yield at a marked crosswalk. Do you admit or deny? I'd like to explain, Your Honor, she said, voice clear and even. The judge finally looked up. His expression was tired, maybe a little impatient. He'd been on the bench for over 20 years. He'd seen every excuse, every sob story, every attempt to talk one's way out of a ticket. Most of them didn't work. This isn't traffic school, he said gently but firmly. It's a court of law. You either admit the violation or we proceed to trial. Given the officer's report and the dashcam footage, I'd advise you to save your time and mine. A few people in the gallery shifted. Someone coughed. The teenager didn't flinch. I'm not asking for leniency based on emotion, she said. I'm asking for a fair hearing based on updated Municipal Code Section 1134B, subsection D, which redefines failure to yield in zones with obstructed visibility due to construction or temporary signage. Silence. Even the bailiff, who'd been half asleep near the door, straightened up. The judge blinked. He leaned forward slightly. Are you quoting city code? Yes, Your Honor. You're representing yourself? Yes. He studied her for a long moment. She didn't look away. Her eyes were calm, focused, not defiant, not nervous. Just present, all right, he said slowly. Cite the exact language. She did, word for word. Then she added, the crosswalk in question was adjacent to a construction zone with a temporary barrier that blocked the driver's line of sight from over 20 feet away. The officer's report confirms the barrier was present, but doesn't address whether visibility met the legal threshold for enforcement under the revised code, which went into effect last month. The judge sat back. He picked up a tablet, tapped a few times, and scrolled. His eyebrows lifted slightly. He turned to the prosecutor, who was now flipping through his own notes with a frown. After a pause, the judge said, Counsel, are you aware of this amendment? The prosecutor cleared his throat. We typically rely on the standard interpretation, Your Honor. I'll need to review. No need, the judge interrupted. He looked back at the teenager. You're correct. The code was updated, and the officer's report lacks the required assessment of visibility conditions. A murmur rippled through the room. The judge tapped his pen against the bench. Fine is reduced to 0. Case dismissed, she nodded once. Thank you, Your Honor. She turned to leave, but then stopped. She turned back. May I say one more thing? The judge raised an eyebrow. You've already said plenty, she smiled faintly. I know, but it's not about the ticket. He gestured for her to continue. I've been watching this courtroom for weeks, she said, voice softer now, but still clear enough for the front rows to hear. I've seen people fined, scolded, even threatened with jail time for small mistakes, while others dressed differently or speaking a certain way get warnings or second chances. I came here today not just to contest a ticket, but to see if the law is applied the same way to everyone, or only to those who look like they belong here. No one moved. The judge didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was quieter than before. And what did you find? She held his gaze. I found that it depends on who's looking. Then she walked out. The courtroom stayed silent for a full 10 seconds after the doors closed behind her. People exchanged glances. Some looked down. Others stared at the empty space where she'd stood, as if trying to figure out what they'd just witnessed. The judge sat very still. He didn't call the next case right away. Instead, he reread the city code amendment on his screen. Then he made a note in his personal journal, something he hadn't done in years during court hours. Outside, the teenager pulled her hood back up and walked down the courthouse steps. The sun was bright, cars honked in the distance, and pigeons scattered as she passed. She didn't look back. She wasn't trying to make a scene. She wasn't looking for applause. She just wanted to be seen for who she really was, not what people assumed. And for the first time that morning, in a room full of adults who thought they knew how the world worked, someone had actually listened. What no one knew, not the judge, not the prosecutor, not the curious onlookers, was that this wasn't just some clever kid who'd memorized a few laws. She'd spent the last 2 years studying, interning, and preparing for a path most people twice her age never dared to walk. She'd already passed the bar exam. She'd written legal briefs that had changed outcomes for real families. But today she chose to show up as an ordinary teenager with a traffic ticket, because sometimes the clearest mirror is held up by someone the world overlooks, and sometimes all it takes is one quiet voice in a crowded room to remind everyone that fairness isn't automatic. It has to be practiced. Every single day. As she disappeared into the city crowd, no one would have guessed she'd just changed the atmosphere of an entire courtroom. Not with anger, not with theatrics, but with knowledge, dignity, and the simple courage to speak truth without shouting. Later that week, the judge would ask his clerk to pull every recent case involving minor violations. He'd review them himself. And for the first time in a long time, he'd wonder how many other people had walked through those doors carrying more than just a citation, carrying hope, fear, or a truth no one bothered to hear. But that's a story for another day. For now, the morning session resumed. The next name was called. Life in the courthouse went on, but something had shifted. Just a little. A few days passed, and the courtroom settled back into its usual rhythm. Papers shuffled, gavels tapped, voices rose and fell in the familiar dance of justice moving at its own stubborn pace. The judge barely thought about the teenager in the hoodie anymore. Or at least that's what he told himself. But something about her stayed with him. Maybe it was the way she'd spoken. Not to win, but to be heard. Not to argue, but to clarify. It nagged at him like a loose thread he couldn't quite pull. Then came Thursday morning. The docket listed a civil case. Tenant versus landlord. It wasn't flashy. No headlines, no cameras. Just a quiet dispute over an eviction notice issued during a rent freeze ordinance. The kind of case that often slipped through the cracks, handled quickly, decided quietly, forgotten by lunchtime. The plaintiff arrived early. She walked in alone, but this time everything was different. No hoodie, no sneakers. She wore a crisp navy suit, simple but sharp, with a white blouse and low heels that clicked softly against the marble floor. Her hair was neatly pulled back. A small silver Bar Association pin gleamed near her collar. She carried a slim leather portfolio and moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going, and why. The judge looked up as she approached the plaintiff's table. He didn't recognize her at first. Not really. The clothes, the posture, the energy. It was like meeting a completely different person. But then she glanced his way and their eyes met. Just for a second. And he knew. His stomach dropped. She gave a small, respectful nod. No smirk, no "I told you so." Just professional courtesy. He nodded back, slower this time, more carefully. The case began like any other. The landlord's attorney, a man in his 50s with a practiced courtroom voice, laid out his argument. Missed payments, breach of contract, standard procedure. He spoke smoothly, citing statutes and precedents, clearly expecting a routine win. Then it was her turn. She stood. Not dramatically. Not with flair. Just stood, placed her notes on the table and began. Your Honor, she said. My client did not miss rent. She paid in full, on time, through a city-approved emergency housing assistance program that was active during the declared public health period. The landlord refused to accept the payment method, claiming it wasn't real money. But under Municipal Ordinance 917C, any payment processed through the city's verified relief portal is legally equivalent to cash. The judge leaned forward. She continued, calm and precise. Furthermore, the eviction notice was dated 3 days before the city's rent stabilization order expired. That means it was issued during a legally protected window. Evicting a tenant under those conditions isn't just unfair, it's unlawful. She didn't raise her voice, didn't gesture wildly. She simply laid out the facts, backed by printed emails, city notices, and screenshots of payment confirmations. Each piece fit like a puzzle snapping into place. The landlord's attorney shifted in his seat. He tried to argue that the program was confusing and that his client didn't understand the rules. She responded gently but firmly. Ignorance of the law isn't a defense, Your Honor, especially when the city sent 3 official notices to every registered landlord, including this one. The judge asked a few questions. She answered each one without hesitation, citing sections, dates, even court rulings from similar cases in neighboring counties. She wasn't showing off. She was serving the truth clean, clear, and complete. When she sat down, the room felt heavier, like the air had thickened with something real. The judge took off his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and looked at the landlord's attorney. Do you have any rebuttal that addresses the ordinance or the payment verification? The attorney hesitated. We weren't aware of the specific wording, Your Honor. That's unfortunate, the judge said, because your client just violated it. He ruled in favor of the tenant. Full dismissal, legal fees awarded, and a strong recommendation that the landlord attend a city compliance workshop, mandatory. As people filed out, the judge watched her pack her things. She didn't celebrate, didn't smile triumphantly. She simply shook her client's hand, said a few quiet words, and gathered her papers. He waited until the room was nearly empty. Then he stepped down from the bench. Can I speak with you for a moment? He asked. She turned. Of course, Your Honor. They stood near the clerk's desk, away from ears and eyes. I owe you an apology, he said, voice lower now, stripped of courtroom formality. Back in traffic court. I saw a kid in a hoodie and assumed you didn't know the first thing about law. I judged you by your clothes, not your mind. She looked at him, not with anger, not with pity, but with something closer to understanding. It happens more than you think, she said. Even to people who've spent years studying, working, proving themselves. Sometimes the world only sees what it expects to see. He nodded slowly. You're licensed then? Really? Yes, passed the bar last year. Started interning at a non-profit legal aid office right after. Most of my clients can't afford lawyers. Some don't even know their rights exist. And the traffic ticket? He asked. Was that part of a plan? She smiled faintly. Not a plan. More like a test. I wanted to see if the system treats someone differently when they look like they don't belong. Turns out, it does. He didn't argue. He couldn't. He'd been part of that system for decades. He knew its blind spots better than anyone. Why didn't you just show your bar card that day? He asked. Because then it wouldn't have been a test, she said. It would have been a performance. I didn't want special treatment. I wanted fairness, and fairness means being heard even when you look like you shouldn't be there. He let that sink in. Then he said, What's your name? For the record, I mean, she told him. He wrote it down, not in his docket, but in the small notebook he kept in his robe pocket. The one he used for reminders, quotes, things he didn't want to forget. They stood in silence for a moment, 2 people from different worlds, connected now by a shared moment of honesty. Before she left, she turned back. You know, most judges would have doubled the fine just to assert authority. You listened. That matters, he almost laughed. I didn't feel like I had a choice. You were right. Being right isn't enough, she said. Someone has to be willing to hear it. Then she walked out, again without looking back. But this time the judge didn't go back to his routine right away. He stood by the window watching the street below. People hurried past, heads down, lives unfolding in ways no one could see just by looking. He thought about all the faces that had passed through his courtroom over the years. How many had he dismissed too quickly? How many truths had he missed because he'd already decided who they were before they even spoke? That afternoon, he called a meeting with his clerks. He asked them to pull every minor violation case from the past 6 months. Not just traffic, noise complaints, loitering, jaywalking, expired permits. He wanted to review them. All of them, not because he expected to overturn rulings, but because he needed to see, really see, how decisions were being made when no one was watching closely. And in his office that evening, he pinned a small note to his bulletin board, right next to his judicial oath. Fairness begins when you stop assuming you know someone before they speak. He didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. Because the young woman in the suit wasn't done, she wasn't there just to win cases. She was there to remind everyone, judges, lawyers, even ordinary people, that justice isn't just written in books. It's practiced in moments, in choices, in the way we look at each other, and sometimes it walks in wearing a hoodie or a navy suit and changes everything without raising its voice. The days that followed were quiet but not empty. The judge found himself noticing things he used to ignore. The way a nervous defendant twisted their hands, how some people spoke louder just to be taken seriously, how others stayed silent even when they had every right to speak. He started asking more questions during hearings, not to trap anyone but to understand, and slowly the atmosphere in his courtroom began to shift. Not dramatically, just enough that regulars noticed. The bailiff commented on it once, saying, "Feels less like a factory in here these days." Then came the big case. It wasn't criminal. No flashing lights, no dramatic arrests, but it mattered deeply. A family of 5 had been forced out of their apartment after their building was sold to a new owner, who claimed the units were being converted to luxury condos. The eviction happened fast. Too fast. No proper notice, no relocation assistance, and worst of all, it happened during winter, with 2 young kids and a grandmother who relied on oxygen. The family had nowhere to go. They stayed with relatives for a while, then a shelter. They tried to file complaints but kept getting passed from one office to another. No one seemed to care until someone connected them with a young attorney who took their case pro bono. When the hearing date arrived, the courtroom was fuller than usual. Not because of media, there wasn't any, but because neighbors came, friends, other tenants from the same building, worried they'd be next. They sat in silence, eyes fixed on the front, hoping someone would finally listen. And then she walked in. Same calm stride, same navy suit, but this time there was a quiet fire in her posture. Not anger, resolve. She carried a thick file, but her hands were steady. She greeted her clients with a gentle nod, a reassuring smile. They looked exhausted, but less afraid now that she was beside them. The judge watched from the bench. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Their eyes met briefly, and in that glance, a silent understanding passed between them. This one matters. The opposing side arrived minutes later, 2 sharply dressed attorneys representing a real estate development firm. They carried leather briefcases, spoke in smooth corporate tones, and referred to the family as the occupants, rather than by name. One of them even yawned while reviewing documents, as if this were just another item on a long to-do list. The hearing began. The developer's lead attorney laid out their argument. The sale was legal. The conversion permits were approved, and the tenants had been offered fair market relocation options. He cited city zoning laws, market trends, even economic growth statistics. It sounded impressive until you listened closely. Then it was her turn. She didn't rush. She stood, adjusted her notes, and spoke directly to the judge, not to show off, but to make sure every word landed. "Your Honor," she began, "my clients weren't offered relocation. They were handed a piece of paper saying they had 10 days to leave. No phone call, no meeting, no discussion. And the so-called fair market option was a listing for a studio apartment, $2,400 a month, in a building that doesn't allow children." A murmur rippled through the gallery. She continued, "More importantly, under the Tenant Protection Act of 2023, any conversion of rent-controlled units into non-residential or luxury use requires a 120-day notice, a relocation stipend of at least $8,000 per household, and proof that alternative housing is available and suitable. None of that happened." She placed 3 documents on the evidence table. "Here's the city's approval letter for the conversion. It explicitly states those requirements. Here's the eviction notice, dated just 9 days after the sale. And here's an email from the property manager admitting they didn't bother with the full process because most tenants don't fight back." The developer's attorney jumped up. "Your Honor, that email is hearsay. It's from your client's own server," she said calmly. "And it was authenticated by the city housing department." The judge raised a hand. "Let her finish," she turned back. "This isn't just about paperwork. It's about people. My clients lost more than an apartment. They lost stability. Their kids missed weeks of school. Their grandmother's health declined because she couldn't get consistent care in a shelter. All because someone decided their lives were less important than profit margins. Her voice didn't crack, but it carried weight, real human weight. Then she did something unexpected. She asked if her clients could speak. The judge hesitated. Usually, only attorneys address the court in civil matters. But he looked at the family, then at her, and nodded. The mother stood. She didn't cry. She spoke softly, clearly. She talked about how her youngest child still asked every night, "When are we going home?" She explained how they'd kept every rent receipt, followed every rule, never caused trouble. "We just wanted to live in peace," she said. "Is that too much to ask?" The grandmother, leaning on a cane, added just one sentence. "We worked hard our whole lives. We deserve dignity, not to be thrown out like trash." When they sat down, the room was utterly still. The developer's attorneys looked uncomfortable. One shuffled papers. The other stared at the floor. The judge took a long breath. Then he turned to the defense table. "Do you have any evidence that the relocation requirements were met? Any signed acknowledgments? Any proof of suitable housing offered?" They didn't. After a pause, the judge said, "This eviction was illegal. Not just unfair, illegal. I'm ordering immediate reinstatement of tenancy, full back rent reimbursement, and the $8,000 relocation stipend as mandated by law. Additionally, I'm referring this matter to the city attorney's office for potential penalties under the Tenant Protection Act." The gallery erupted, not in cheers, but in quiet sighs of relief, a few soft claps quickly hushed by the bailiff. But the emotion was real. As the family hugged each other, tears finally flowing, the young attorney simply gathered her things. She didn't gloat. She didn't pose for anyone. She just placed a hand on the mother's shoulder and whispered something that made her nod through her tears. Later, in the hallway, the judge found her again. "You knew they'd win," he said. "I hoped they would," she corrected. "But hoping isn't enough. You have to fight." "Why take this case?" he asked. "You could be working at a big firm, making serious money." She looked at him, eyes steady. "Money doesn't fix broken systems, people do, and someone has to stand with those who can't stand alone." He nodded. Then after a beat he asked, "Was this part of your project too? The one about fairness?" She smiled faintly. "Everything I do is part of that project." They stood in silence for a moment, the noise of the courthouse fading around them. Before she left, she handed him a small envelope. "For your records," she said. Inside was a printed copy of the city's tenant protection guidelines, with her handwritten notes in the margins, highlighting sections often ignored or misapplied. At the bottom she'd written, "Justice isn't abstract. It's what happens when someone shows up for you." He tucked it into his robe pocket right next to his notebook. That evening he didn't go straight home. He walked to the public library, sat at a quiet table, and read every page of the housing code she'd referenced. Then he called the city clerk's office and asked how many similar cases had been filed in the past year. The answer surprised him. 2, many and too few with lawyers like her. As he walked back to his car under the streetlights, he realized something. He'd spent years believing he was upholding the law, but maybe, just maybe, he'd been missing the point. The law wasn't just about rules, it was about people. And sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was walk into a courtroom wearing a suit or a hoodie and say, "This isn't right." And sometimes the most powerful thing a judge could do was listen. A few weeks had passed since the tenant case, and the courthouse buzzed with a different kind of energy. Not louder, not flashier, but quieter, more thoughtful. People seemed to stand a little straighter when they spoke. Attorneys double-checked their citations. Even the clerk started offering water to nervous defendants before their hearings. Something had shifted, and though no one said it out loud, everyone knew why. The judge felt it most of all. He'd begun arriving earlier each morning, not just to review cases but to sit in the empty courtroom and think. He'd reread old rulings of his own, searching for moments where he might have rushed, assumed, or overlooked. He hadn't found many glaring errors, but he'd found plenty of missed chances to ask one more question, to listen 1 minute longer. Then, one rainy Thursday, he spotted her again. She wasn't in court that day. She was in the hallway outside the clerk's office, helping an elderly man fill out forms. He looked lost, clutching a wrinkled envelope, his glasses fogged from the damp air. She knelt slightly to meet his eye level, pointing to lines on the page, speaking slowly and clearly. When he fumbled with his pen, she didn't take it from him. She just waited, patient, giving him the dignity of doing it himself. The judge watched from a distance. He didn't interrupt. He just stood there, coffee in hand, remembering how he'd once dismissed someone who looked just as unassuming. Later, during lunch break, he found her in the courthouse cafeteria. She sat alone at a corner table, eating a simple sandwich and reviewing case notes. He walked over, tray in hand. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. She looked up, surprised but not startled. "Of course, Your Honor," he sat. For a while they ate in silence. Then he said, "I've been thinking about what you said, that fairness means being heard even when you don't look like you belong." She nodded, chewing slowly. "It's not just about looks," she added. "It's about voice, tone, accent, how much money you have. Whether you know the right words to say. The system's built for people who already understand the rules. Everyone else has to figure it out while standing in the fire." He stirred his coffee even though it didn't need stirring. "I've been on the bench 23 years, he said quietly. "I always believed I treated everyone the same. But you showed me that same isn't always fair." She looked at him, really looked. "Most people don't mean to be unfair," she said. "They just don't see the barriers they're not facing." He let that settle. Then he asked, "Why did you come back here? After the traffic ticket, after the tenant case? You could have taken your wins and walked away." She smiled, a small, tired smile. "Because winning one case doesn't fix the system. It just helps one family. I want to help change how the system sees people." He leaned forward. "How?" She set her sandwich down. "By showing up. Again and again. Not as a symbol, not as a stunt, but as a reminder that competence isn't tied to age, appearance, or title. And that justice shouldn't depend on whether someone looks professional enough to deserve it." He thought about that. Then he said, "What if I told you I wanted to do better? Not just as a judge, but as a person in this system?" She didn't answer right away. She looked out the window at the rain tapping against the glass. "Actions speak louder than apologies," she finally said. "But intentions matter too if they lead to change." That afternoon, the judge did something unusual. He called a meeting. Not with other judges or administrators, but with public defenders, legal aid volunteers, and even a few community advocates. He asked them one question. Where does our courtroom fail people who need it most? The answers came fast. People don't understand legal terms. Forms are confusing, written like they're meant to scare you off. If you miss one hearing because your bus was late, your case gets tossed. No one explains your rights unless you ask. And most don't know they can. He took notes, real ones. Not for show, for action. Over the next week, he worked with the clerk's office to create a one-page Know Your Rights handout in plain language, available in 5 languages. He asked bailiffs to gently guide lost visitors instead of just pointing. He even started opening each session with a clear, simple explanation of what would happen that day. No legalese, just human words. And then came the moment he'd been dreading and hoping for. He asked her to meet him in his chambers. When she arrived, he closed the door and handed her a folder. I've been reviewing every minor violation case from the last 6 months, he said, and I found 23 where the defendant was fined or penalized without proper consideration of updated laws. Language barriers or extenuating circumstances like medical emergencies or job loss. She flipped through the pages. Each one had his handwritten notes in the margin. Assumed guilt. Didn't verify income status. Ignored new ordinance. I can't undo those rulings, he said. But I can correct them. I've drafted motions to reopen each case. I'll offer reduced fines, payment plans, or dismissals where appropriate, but I need someone to help notify the people affected, someone they'll trust. He looked at her. Will you help? She didn't say yes right away. She studied his face, searching for sincerity. Then she nodded. On one condition. Name it. That you don't do this just because of me. Do it because it's right. I already am, he said. She smiled. Then yes, what followed wasn't glamorous. It was phone calls, letters, community center visits. She tracked down people who'd moved, changed numbers, given up hope. Some were skeptical. Why would a judge care now? One man asked. She told him the truth. Because someone finally listened. Slowly, people came back to court, not in fear but with cautious hope. One woman, A single mother fined for parking in a loading zone while rushing her sick child to the clinic had her fine wiped clean. A retired veteran penalized for missing a hearing due to a hospital stay got his license reinstated. A teenager cited for skateboarding in a banned zone, unaware the sign had been moved, was offered community service instead of a fine. Each case was small on paper, but to the people involved it was everything, and through it all, the judge watched, listened, learned. One evening, after a long day of hearings, he found her waiting near the courthouse steps. "You've changed things," she said. "No," he replied. "You reminded me what this job is really about." She shook her head. "It's not about me. It's about all the people who never got a second look. I just happened to be the one wearing a hoodie that day." He smiled. Sometimes the right person shows up at the right time. They stood in silence as the city lights flickered on around them. Before she left, she turned. "You know, most people think justice is about punishment, but it's really about repair. About making things right, not just legally, but humanly." He nodded. "I'm starting to understand that." And for the first time in years, he truly meant it. Back in his office, he opened his notebook and wrote a new line beneath the old one. "Fairness isn't a rule. It's a choice you make every time someone stands before you, no matter what they're wearing." Outside, the rain had stopped. The streets glistened under the streetlights, clean and quiet, as if the whole city had taken a breath, and somewhere, a teenager in a hoodie or a suit was walking home, knowing that showing up, speaking up, and standing firm could still change the world, one courtroom at a time. Months passed, and the ripples from that first courtroom encounter kept spreading, quietly, steadily, like water finding its way through cracks in stone. The judge no longer saw his role as just enforcing rules. He saw it as protecting people, and the young attorney. She didn't vanish after her victories. She stayed, working, listening, showing up in places where legal help was needed most but rarely found. One spring morning, she opened a small office on the edge of the city's oldest neighborhood. No fancy sign, no marble floors, just a modest storefront with a simple placard in the window. Community legal support. Free help for tenants, workers, and families. Inside, there were folding chairs, a second-hand desk, a coffee pot that never ran dry, and shelves lined with binders full of city codes, tenant rights, and labor laws, all marked in plain English, with sticky notes explaining what each section really meant. Word spread fast. People came, not in suits, but in work uniforms, school backpacks, hospital scrubs. They came with eviction notices, unfair pay stubs, custody questions, immigration fears. And every time she met them at eye level, no jargon, no judgment, just tell me what happened, and then, here's what we can do. She didn't take every case, but she made sure no one left without knowing their rights. Sometimes that meant writing a letter. Sometimes it meant showing up with them at a landlord's office. And sometimes it meant walking back into that same courthouse not as a surprise but as a known force for fairness. The judge noticed. Not just her presence, but the change in the people who came with her. They stood taller, spoke clearer. They weren't just defendants or petitioners anymore. They were people with names, stories, and rights worth defending. One afternoon he visited her office. He didn't announce himself. Just knocked on the door during a lull between clients. She opened it, surprised but not shocked, as if she'd been expecting him all along. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. The room smelled like old books and fresh coffee. Posters on the wall explained how to file a wage claim or request a court interpreter. A whiteboard listed upcoming community workshops. Know your rights as a renter, how to read a legal document, what to do if you're stopped by police. "You built this from nothing," he said, looking around. "Not from nothing," she corrected gently. "From need," he nodded. "I've been thinking, what if we made this official? Not just your office, but a partnership. The court could fund a legal navigator program, someone who helps people understand the system before they even step into a courtroom. Someone like you," she raised an eyebrow. "You'd trust a kid in a hoodie to train court staff?" He smiled. "I'd trust someone who taught an old judge how to see again." They talked for hours that day, about training clerks to spot vulnerable cases, about simplifying forms, about creating a quiet room where nervous witnesses could gather themselves before testifying. By the time he left, they had a rough plan, and for the first time, The courthouse wasn't just a place of judgment, it was becoming a place of support. News of the partnership reached the local law schools. Invitations followed. She was asked to speak at panels, not as a prodigy, but as a practitioner who believed law should serve people, not confuse them. Students listened, not because she was young, but because she spoke like someone who'd walked the streets they only read about in textbooks. Meanwhile, the judge began mentoring new judges, sharing what he'd learned. Don't just hear the words, he'd tell them. Hear the person behind them. Sometimes the truth isn't in the file, it's in the silence between sentences. Back in her office, she kept working. One day, a teenager walked in, maybe 16, wearing a hoodie just like the one she'd worn months ago. He'd been cited for loitering near a closed bus stop after school. His mom worked nights. He had nowhere else to wait. She listened. Then she called the city attorney's office. Within a week, the charge was dropped, and the city agreed to install benches and lighting at that stop. When the teen thanked her, eyes wide with disbelief, she just said, "Now you know your rights. Next time, teach someone else." That became her motto, not written on a wall but lived in every interaction. As summer turned to fall, something remarkable happened. The number of default judgments, cases lost because people didn't show up, dropped by nearly 40% in the judge's courtroom. Why? Because people finally believed someone would listen if they came, and they did come, in greater numbers, with more confidence. One rainy November day, the judge received a letter. Not from a lawyer, not from a city official, from a grandmother, the same one from the tenant case. She wrote that her family was back in their apartment, her health had improved, and her grandchildren were doing well in school. At the end, she added, "Thank you for seeing us. Not just our papers, us." He read it 3 times. Then he pinned it next to the note in his office. Around the same time, the young attorney got her own letter from the courthouse clerk who'd once rolled her eyes at another kid with a traffic ticket. Now, that same clerk ran the new Navigator program, helping lost visitors find their way. She wrote, "You didn't just change the judge, you changed all of us." Neither of them talked about fame or recognition. They didn't need to. The proof was in the quiet moments: a mother keeping her home, a worker getting back stolen wages, a teenager avoiding a record that could have haunted him for life. And the judge? He still presided over cases, still wore his robe, still tapped his gavel. But now, before each session, he took a breath and reminded himself, this isn't about power, it's about people. One evening, long after court had ended, he saw her through the courthouse window, standing on the steps, talking to a group of high school students on a field trip. She wasn't lecturing. She was listening, nodding, smiling, pointing to the building and saying something that made them laugh. He watched for a moment, then turned away, a quiet pride warming his chest. Because the truth was, brilliance didn't always wear a robe. Sometimes it wore a hoodie. Sometimes it carried a coffee-stained legal pad and a heart that refused to accept injustice as normal. And sometimes, all it took was one person, showing up, speaking up, and refusing to be invisible, to remind an entire system that fairness isn't a luxury, it's the foundation. As the city lights flickered on and the courthouse emptied for the night, the doors closed softly behind her. But the work didn't stop. It never would, because justice, real justice, isn't a single victory. It's a daily choice to see, to listen, and to believe that everyone, no matter how they look or where they come from, deserves to be heard. And in that quiet commitment, change doesn't just happen, it grows.